Hello, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and it's my friend Keshav Betts. And we're about to continue within Divine Friendship, really one of the happiest, nicest classes I think I've ever done. So we'll start with a prayer, then Keshav will do a couple of chants, a few minutes of meditation. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. We are living this life as best we can, Lord, but we are unable to find our way without your guidance. We need you to be with us, to make your presence known, to make your will known to us, that we may make the right decisions and go day by day in the light, moving ever closer to the heart of that light, which is your unconditional love for all of creation. Om, peace, amen.
I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, in secret in my soul. I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet.
Now have just a few minutes of meditation. Om peace. Amen. Well, my friends, here we are once more. So, this is October 3rd, 1987. The summary of this is, and I'm going to read it, a woman, fearing her husband might be possessed, had received shocking advice from a minister of Master's organization, somewhere else, not Ananda. Dear so-and-so, Swami writes, dear blank, I am sad about your situation. You and your husband are in my prayers. I cannot understand the advice to cut all ties with the spiritual path. It's true that Brother Blank knows you both and may well be aware of things in your husband that don't come to me through your letter. I would have thought, however, that while the advice not to meditate may well be perfectly sound, some more physical service for God would therefore have become all the more vitally necessary. Surely God is the answer to all our problems. The issue is only how we approach Him. Couldn't your husband have been encouraged to work on the grounds at the ashram? Or if his condition is such that it would have demanded too much energy to supervise him, couldn't he have been encouraged to work for God and gurus, that is, in the thought of them, in your own garden? Surely it was a mistake to cut him and you off from the path. I must admit there is much here that I don't understand. If indeed your husband is possessed, isn't there something to be done about it? Master said that chanting Om in the right ear insistently with deep faith and concentration is one way of driving out astral entities. Another thing to practice is to make large circles of light around the body, joining the hands in front and then behind while chanting Om Tat Sat. Then to trace out Om on one's pillow 3 times with the forefinger before going to sleep. In all of these teachings, there is the constant rejoinder to cling more than ever to God, not as an escape, which is why in certain cases it is better not to meditate, but with faith. If you can't cling to God, to whom in God's name can we cling? It is only the presence of higher vibrations that can drive out these lower ones. Please write again and let me hear how you and your husband are doing in divine friendship. That was a really scary letter. There's just so much about it that's super scary. Let's start with the simple question of possession, which I think, unfortunately, I'm doing a lot of broadcasts, so I lose track of when I last talked about it. But I know possession was discussed somewhere that I was talking recently. Because possession does happen. It happens when we exercise insufficient willpower to maintain proper relationship with our unconsciousness. And I don't just mean being a little lazy. I mean really being, well, primarily people become possessed when they use, or often people become possessed when they use drugs or when they drink a lot, when they basically injure their willpower, their capacity to be conscious. Master said that dark entities hover around bars and other places where people become so inebriated they literally lose control and lose consciousness. And then sometimes they'll slip in. Astral entities also sometimes possess people when they have a karmic in their past lives, when they've perhaps dabbled in black magic or something like that. But by no means are all cases of mental imbalance possession. Only very rarely and only sometimes. And I don't know much about it, but it's distinctly different than just being in your own subconscious. When another actual entity is in you, another consciousness that doesn't have a body is using your body, and that's all you're working with. Years ago, in the first 10 years that I was part of Ananda, I lived with a group of women. We had a little convent together. And this woman came to stay with us. She was given the name Mohini. She's not on the planet anymore. I don't even know or remember what her English name was, but we called her Mohini. And she was truly mentally unbalanced. And she'd been in a very wealthy family, but a horrific family. And she'd been on psychiatric medication, I think, since she was a child almost. And her brain was really addled. She was very wealthy and very, very generous. This bangle that I wear is the result of her generosity. She just bought about 30 or 40 of these bangles back in those days when a lot of the founding members of Ananda could never have afforded them. So a lot of us who wear them to this day was from her. They cost $150 each. I think they cost $2,500 now, or some wild sum like that. It's because of the price of gold entirely. She was very generous. She bought Swami the gem bangle that he wears. Yes, the one that he wears is the one he got through her. Well, I say that as if you were still with us. The one Jyotish wears is the one that she bought. But she was completely mentally unbalanced. And in fact, an Ayurvedic doctor, an Indian man with a great deal of intuition, said that she was in fact possessed. And that this is how he put it, that the entities that inhabited her, and it was quite reasonable to think that she was possessed. She was just so strange in so many ways. But here's the whole point of this. Sometimes when she was asleep, and this is what the doctor said, the entities would roam around looking for someone else to inhabit because they'd get bored. This is all what was said to me. And I know that they visited me. I felt them come into, I woke up in like this. I lived in this little trailer by myself, and out of pitch blackness, because there was no electricity, I just woke up like this, and there was somebody in my trailer. In fact, there were multiples, several somebodies, and they were very unpleasant, and they really frightened me. I was really scared about their being there. I turned on all the lights. I think I turned on Swami's voice. I just wasn't quite sure what to do. Well, what was fun to me is they also visited my friend Seva. And what Seva's response to them was completely different. She was our mother superior, even though it wasn't formal, but she was in charge. She sort of sat up in bed and said, "Why don't you just get out of here? Why don't you leave us all alone? Why don't you leave Mohini alone? What you're doing is so bad for you." She just scolded them, just like she would have scolded us. It was so perfect. And it was exactly right, you see, because they were just tramp souls. They were just really, literally, they were just people like you and me. They just didn't have bodies. And they weren't cooperating with the natural flow of things. They were haunting the physical world and trying to have physical bodies when it wasn't their karma to have them. And Seva just gave them what for. And after that, actually, they never troubled any of us again. I mean, I just loved that. I loved her impulse, and I loved the demystification of it. Now, of course, dark entities can be powerful, but people can be powerful. When you go up against something that's evil, and a disincarnate entity, some of them are just stupid, meaning they're doing something stupid. But sometimes there's also real darkness there. So you can't just imagine that you can play with it. Swami himself tells the story of wanting to have the experience of a disincarnate being and having it while he was asleep, but it wasn't a dream. And he was in the presence, but suddenly he felt that evil was really strong, and it was stronger. Its force to take him over was stronger, felt like it could be stronger than his power to resist. So he just called, "Master, Master," like that, and immediately the darkness went away because the Guru's power was just obliterated it. That's in the Bible. There's countless stories of Jesus driving the demons out. It's a real thing. So now we come to this modern story where this woman's husband, is he possessed? Who knows if he's possessed? Nobody in these days usually can tell. Reading between the lines, he must have been a disruptive force in the ashram. And reading between the lines, I think he frightened the people there. They didn't know what to do with him. But Swami himself just says, why would you remove such a person from spiritual contact? Why would you advise such a person to give up spiritual contact? Absolutely the one thing they need is spiritual contact. Now, there's perhaps parts of the story we don't know. Swami's being very generous. Perhaps your husband showed something that I don't read through the letter. I think Swami was responding intuitively as he did. And he felt that a great confusion was setting in here. But sometimes when people are giving advice, their own prejudices come to the fore. Swami, he put it to us saying it's presumptuous not to take yourself into account. I've been in situations before where I knew that I couldn't give advice. I knew that I couldn't be as centered about some person or another, not usually because I didn't like them, but because the nature of their difficulty was not something I was skilled in dealing with. So just what we know. We just know that we can't handle something really well. It's better to find somebody else who can. Because what Swami says, whatever the man's problem was, the answer to every problem is God. So anything that takes you farther away from your relationship with God. Now, he does acknowledge, and I took the trouble to read the whole letter because there's real advice here on how to deal with dark energy. But it usually is not, usually, I would say most of the time, it is inadvisable to meditate when you do not have mental balance. And it's definitely inadvisable to meditate when you have an inclination to be influenced by forces outside yourself. So do not think, for people who are mentally unbalanced, that meditation is a good idea. It is not. In the early years of Ananda, especially, I would say partly before we became more skilled at what we were doing, we lived outside the rational norm. That would be the only way you could say it. Most people in the world live within very narrow parameters of what's acceptable and what's real and what's of interest. And, at Ananda, we lived, the walls were down. We just had this extraordinarily expanded picture of reality, of the possible, of ourselves, of other people. And so people who are slightly mentally unbalanced have also taken down the boundaries. They've taken down the boundaries of what is considered to be normal and sane. But most of the time, they have just spread sideways. They haven't actually spread upward, they've just spread sideways. And mostly, they've poured into the subconscious. And in this case, what the subconscious is an entirely subjective world. And in that entirely subjective world, if you're spiritually inclined, you can bring Jesus and you can bring Krishna and you can bring God himself and Divine Mother. There is an objective, superconscious reality to saints and masters and manifestations of God. And then there is a subconscious hallucinatory fiber, false visions. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, one of the shortcomings on the spiritual path, one of the dangers on the spiritual path is false visions. And it's really interesting that it rises to the level where Patanjali mentions it specifically. One of the really serious potential problems on the spiritual path is false visions. So merely because someone asserts to you that they see Jesus Christ or that Krishna's telling them what to do or they have a direct line to Divine Mother, I don't mean for you to be suspicious, but I do mean for you to keep your mind open. Because when people are having genuine superconscious experiences like that, their lives are completely changed. They don't just remain the same person, except that now Jesus is leading them by the hand. There is an extraordinary revolution in the way they relate to the world, because those saints and masters don't just wander in because somebody thinks it would be nice. So whenever you're dealing with someone with mental imbalance who is also spiritually inclined, there's just a lot that you have to figure out. When we first started at Ananda, we ourselves didn't know what to do. So people would think we were kindred spirits because they were living in an expanded world and we were living in a world, but we really quickly learned not only were we not in the same world, our world was very bad for these people, very unhealthy, because whereas we were mentally sound, seeking to transcend limitation, they were mentally unsound and they needed to get in to narrow, defined consciousness. And so they would come with us and try to skip over into our world, but that was really bad for them. We got very good at taking them to the bus station with good wishes and bus fare if it was needed. But no, your Ananda is not your place, even though you think it is. So one has to leave a little room for that. But I know Swamiji, when he writes something careful, like perhaps there's something there that was not revealed to me through this letter. I think Swami was dismayed by the advice that was given, which it was probably given because the man was disruptive. Let's just probably presume that. And Swami says it perfectly, too hard to supervise. See, Swami's he's so skillful with words so that he doesn't say anything that is discouraging or or negative, and yet he makes it very clear. Why couldn't he just work in the garden at the ashram there? But if he is too hard to supervise, so what is implied in that? That he's disruptive, and that somebody has to be with him all the time, that he can't just work on his own. So it's a very sympathetic way of raising a very serious question, letting the brother off the hook, and also trying to get the wife to see things more clearly. But, and then here's the line in the letter that really is the most important. He says, how does he say it? Oh, well, no, I don't quite find the line. But what he says, yes, there it is. God is the answer to all our problems. The issue is only how we approach him. And so that means it's not like you just do Kriya Yoga or just go into seclusion or just sit in silence. If we can't do any of those things, we can still go to God because he is the solution to all our problems. It's just a question of how we are able to approach him. So if one doorway is closed to you because, for example, you're not mentally stable enough to meditate safely, then you can serve, or you can chant, or you can work in the garden. You can do something that you do with the thought of God, because he's always there and he will always solve every problem. It's just how we get to that solution. So, very odd and interesting letter. All right. This letter says, the summary of this letter is, try not to mix with those who can tempt you. And Master said, environment is stronger than willpower. January 28th, this is 1974. Dear blank. Because of your mother's deteriorating health condition, I think you ought to help by being with her for now, giving her your love and spiritual support. I strongly suggest that you not mix with friends who can tempt you into old ways of life that you have hoped to leave behind forever. Even out of love for them, you should leave them for now, for you will be their truest friend if you can develop the strength in yourself to affect them on a higher level. The yoga postures are helpful, but not nearly so much as meditation and devotional communion with God. I urge you to learn how to meditate and to practice meditation at least an hour and a half every day. In addition to that, be of service to others, particularly at this time to your mother, feeling that it is God you are serving, not man, and also that it is his power that you are using in your service. So perhaps, I don't know anything about this letter, but it sounds like either someone who was living at Ananda needed to go back to take care of a parent, or perhaps someone who was already living away. But it sounds like a person who was in transition, so let's assume it was somebody visiting. I find it interesting and notable that Swami says you need to take care of your mother. He didn't always say that. There's, especially, let me phrase it differently. Sometimes there is a need to trust. There's a story told about Dayamata that Swamiji tells in the Path, where Dayamata came to Swami, to Master, and said, my mother is old and isn't able to take care of herself. Perhaps I should go work to support her. And Master became quite emphatic and actually told her to leave the ashram because they only wanted people who were 100%. And she was horrified at his reaction. Master, I would never leave. I would never go. She was just concerned about the mother. And Master said, that's better. He said, God will take care of your mother. And then later, Master himself invited the woman to come live at Mount Washington. So the way she got taken care of is she lived at Mount Washington till the end of her life. 3 of her 4 or 5 children, actually 4 of her children became involved with Master. 2 of them stayed for a lifetime. So the first part of it is that we do have these duties, and we can't just say, I'm living for God, I don't have to do it anymore. Sometimes it really is our highest duty, but Swami's concerned because in 1974, it's likely the person was in their 20s, quite likely, like most of the people who came to Ananda, he had a more licentious lifestyle in his past, because many of the people who came to Ananda were rebellious, and it was the drug era, and it was just, everything was breaking loose, the hippies, everything. So it sounds quite likely that this man had was not very far away from a lifestyle that was not the same as the spiritual lifestyle he was aspiring to, because also Swami tells him to learn to meditate, so he can't have been very much into it. He must have really just been, perhaps not dilettante, but he must have been very, very much of a novice. And so Swami sees the picture easily. He goes back to his hometown, his old friends come knocking at the door, and immediately this sort of sympathetic resonance wakes up in you. It's like, oh yeah, what does it matter? We'll just go out and have a few beers, like, we'll just go to a club or two. What difference does it make? Just for old time's sake, I'm not really doing this anymore. And then also the friends put pressure on you. Come on, you become such a party pooper. You're just a holier than thou guy now. Who do you think you are anyway? These are like our so-called friends. Swamiji strongly suggests, don't even go near them. Don't entertain them. Don't let them be in the house. Don't talk to them. Because your power to resist is not necessarily stronger than their power to attract. And these are very important things. Environment is stronger than willpower. That's how Master put it. And when you're just getting out of a bad habit, that is not the time to put yourself into the vibration again. It will just awaken it within you. Master had very strong things to say about alcohol, interestingly. He said, the habit of being an alcoholic can be awakened with one drink. He said, whereas, it's modern to think, people should experiment, they should be allowed to find out. Master said you should never take even one sip of alcohol. He said, you don't know what you have behind you. It might just reawaken a lifetime of addiction just like that. Yeah, he took it very seriously. He wasn't being narrow-minded or dogmatic. He was just speaking. We don't know what kind of karma we have. We don't know what kind of samskars can be awakened by wrong choices. Delusion is very powerful and very subtle, and that's worth remembering. Now, this woman, I remember this woman. I know who this is. She lived on the opposite side of the country in one of the southern states. She was attracted to Swami, wanted to be part of Ananda, but also felt that she felt she wanted to serve where she was because there was nobody else there doing it. It was a complete wilderness of spirituality. I actually went with Swami and visited there, and it was a wasteland. There just wasn't anything happening. It was not like California. It was not the Bay Area. I don't know what state it was, and I'm such a California snob. I don't want to, I just am. So I don't even know really the names of all the southern states, but it was one of them. February 26th, this was 2001. Dear, I hope you'll be able to do something with the suggestions I made. Now, bear in mind, because I was there, they'd purchased some small property. She had these ideas about she could start a community. She sort of was trying to make all these things happen. But what Swami perceived, which it's a difficult thing, and I've watched it many, many times. A community is people, and you need a core of people. And yes, if you have a place, that's a nice thing to have, but a core of people can create a lot of magnetism without a place. But a place without a core of people will not in itself create magnetism. And it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. Swami Kriyananda bought land, before he had enough people to populate it, but he had a solid core, Jyotish and Jaya and Devi and Sadhana Devi, just sort of at the same time that he was building his physical place, he was teaching classes 5 nights a week throughout the Bay Area, and he was gathering a group of people who understood what he was doing, because without those people, he would have just had buildings. So this woman had some little property that they'd bought, which it was an okay property, but it wasn't very magnetic. It was just something that they had. So Swami did his best. He did his very best to try to, and this is always a fine line, you see. People are being affirmative, they're being positive, they have high aspirations. And Swamiji always had to balance. He didn't want to be a wet blanket. He didn't want to discourage them. He didn't want to he knew that sometimes people have to learn their own lessons, even if that means they have to go forward and fail. Swami said sometimes you have to even encourage people to do something you know they're not going to succeed at, because they're set on doing it and they need the experience. They're not going to learn unless you just let them have that experience. So Swami's advice was always a little tricky, because sometimes he would tell you to go ahead, but he wasn't telling you to go ahead because in any way it was a good idea. He was just telling you to go ahead because you were so set on it and that you were going to learn. And he would let you learn. So you couldn't say, but Swami is in favor of this idea. There was a man that I knew, I specifically sat through this. He had many talents. His best talent was that he was a very good teacher. And even though, as Swami said, he had a lot of ego in other areas of his life, when it came to teaching, he was not very egoic. It was just it just wasn't something that fed his ego. But he really wanted to be a successful businessman. And he didn't really have the talent to be a businessman. And I sat there through the conversation in which Swami said precisely, it's not spiritually necessary for you to be a success at business. You don't have to master that. But somehow he walked out thinking that Swami wanted him to start the business. And when it was a disaster, and I told him that what Swami had said, he didn't even remember it. Just went right over his head. So, Swami there's another story I tell in my book, Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him. I think it was a woman, came to Swamiji really with her desires set on doing something, this certain thing that Swami knew was not a good idea, and it did not end well. And but the person was just so set on it that finally Swami, I don't exactly know how it came to it. Will you bless what I'm doing? I think is what she said to him. He said, I bless you. I always bless you. And she didn't hear the nuance. Will you bless what I'm doing? I bless you. I always bless you. Meaning I bless you. No, I don't bless what you're doing. But she didn't hear it. And later, much later, realized what he'd said to her. So anyway, now, I hope you'll be able to do something with the suggestions I made. I recognize the problems you'll have, especially the fact that because they do represent a compromise, they won't in themselves lead people even to think in terms of attaining high spiritual states. But then how many achieve such states anyway? The important thing first is to get them to include God and spirituality in their lives and spiritual aspiration. So she was trying to just, bring her ideals farther and farther down so she could meet the people around her. But Swami was trying to tell her, you may be able to help them, but is that really what you want to do? If the different churches could at least unite in this understanding, very much could be accomplished. And my sense for the South is that from there this understanding could spread, as it never will adequately if it lets itself get bogged down in religious dogmas. He just goes to, so I really have deep hopes for what you can do. Remember, people are more important than things. You do need buildings to house activity, but it is people, not buildings, that will accomplish these high objectives. Their minds and above all their hearts must be affected. You can do it with God's grace and with inner guidance. You have the talent and the intuition. You need very much now to redirect your thinking from things to people. Where you live, however, the pickings will be few to non-existent. You need a broader audience. Now, what was going on here, and I didn't read all the paragraphs, Swami's addressing a lot of big abstract thoughts this woman had. She's going to start this movement among the churches. She's going to start this movement in education. This is what the South needs. This is my home. This is how we're going to reform it. So Swami was trying to sort of talk to her on that level, but he realized that, sitting where she was, just with all these grand ideas about how she was going to change the whole society, she was really never going to get anywhere. So that's where he said, people are more important than things. This is what I was saying before I started reading the letter. So he said, there's not many people around you. So he suggested that she go on the radio. This was the funniest thing when we were there. He was watching this whole thing where she's trying to make this community happen, and there's just not a chance in the world. Out of just nowhere, he says, I think you should get a radio program. Just like that. And because it would have worked. Well, as I said, only two things will affect the kind of change in society you want: inspiration, a push upward from below, or a push upward from below in the form of urgency for change. The second is something over which you and I have no control, but I feel it is coming. Perhaps first in the form of a real economic depression. Now, isn't this interesting? This is 2001, and now we're in 2020, and it looks like this might really happen. There are two ways that society will change. One is to be inspired by the light and have individuals or many individuals run toward the light. The other is to be pushed from below, which means that circumstances become so difficult that we become desperate to find a way to calm our fears and ease our hearts from suffering. So, this Great Depression, when it comes, can be turned into a great blessing. And he refers to the suggestions that he's made for her radio program will be much needed to direct people's minds in a more positive direction. So now Swami talks a little bit about the South, which is just sort of interesting. As for the first, the need for inspiration, what I felt in the South, as we're talking about the southern states of the USA, I think we might have been in one of the Carolinas, was a certain spiritual complacency, even lethargy. Can people feel inspired to rise above the level of being merely good neighbors and begin actively seeking God and serving Him in others? Not so long as they aspire to nothing higher than a good life instead of a divinely guided one. I think it will be difficult to inspire people to higher aspirations until complacency is shattered. Isn't that interesting? He makes the difference. I mean, people aspire to a good life, which is not the same as to aspire to a divinely guided life. I remember a woman came to our church for a while, and she was a very good woman and a friend of mine, but it was a stretch for her to embrace the values, the teachings, our teachings. It was just, she could touch the edge of it, but it was just a stretch for her. And I remember she had been raised in two different forms of very traditional Christianity. And I remember her sort of saying to me in a somewhat sort of suspicious, like, I think I'm beginning to uncover the secret here. She asked me if Ananda really believed in family values, which is a code word for family. I don't know exactly what it's a code word for, but it's about marriage and raising children. It's elevating to a divine ideal family life, ordinary family life, where you marry, you raise children, your children marry, you have the grandchildren, and this sort of very traditional family like that. I don't know if Ananda believes in family values. I said, well, goodness, we don't disbelieve in them. I said, but you're correct. It's that Ananda is not based on, and didn't have the words, but it's what he said here. We're not just trying to have a good life, a nice home, a respectable family, a good career. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to transcend this world altogether. So yes, those values, if you're going to live that life, you should have good values. But no, that's not what we aspire to do. That's not the life we aspire to lead. And so Swami says here, for people to move beyond the desire just to have a good life, to actually have divine aspiration, he said something has to break the lethargy. That's a really interesting way to put it. And what will break the lethargy is when that life becomes impossible. It's just not an option, or to attain it becomes too chaotic. And then something may happen. And then Swami says there is more spiritual openness in the West, the Western states of America, for the primary reason that there's also more tension and inner dissatisfaction. Greed exists everywhere, but I think in the South there is less consciousness of that soul disease. This is good in a human sense, but inasmuch as the disease of ignorance exists anyway, the awareness of it can be a great incentive. more openness in the West because there's more consciousness of, well, if you think about it, it's the ecology movement and the hippie movement and even the techno innovation, but it's like in the West Coast is where things are being changed. They're much less traditional. We're much less just going along with things. There's a dissatisfaction with the way things are and a desire to make them into something else, which is the beginning of openness to spiritual life. What you need now is to see everyone as your family. Most of the people I met during my visit there were your family members and their friends. A good thing, of course, good if they're interested. But remember the words of Jesus Christ, who is my mother, father, and brethren, but those who love God. Reach out to others. You have the ability, and God wants to give you his grace to do so. Very interesting. Swami believed a lot in this woman, but he was right. I remember being there. All the people we met turned out to be cousins and uncles. I mean, she was trying to start a movement, but she hadn't gone beyond her blood relatives. So Swami tried very much to break her out of the ideas she was working with that were not going to work. I think he really wanted her to come and spend time in California to really learn a new way of doing things, but it was more than she could do. But she had the karma to bring him all the way to her house and have him be a guest in her house for at least 4 or 5 days, I think. I was there the whole time. I mean, that's very unusual. She never succeeded, at least not as far as I know, in accomplishing what she wanted, but perhaps she went a necessary step in that direction. And this is a letter from 1990 to a truth seeker whose visit to Ananda renewed her faith. Thank you for sharing your experiences with me. I am pleased to hear how these experiences have reaffirmed your faith in God and Christ. I try to serve this same Christ, and I hope this work of Ananda is helping others' faith to be deepened also. I pray that I may be ever open to his guidance. Then he's obviously responding to something she wrote. Without in any way detracting from the validity of your teacher's experience of Christ, I would say it often happens that when one gets a glimpse of the divine, he assumes it is the one and only true glimpse, and that other revelations are wrong. This is a sign of spiritual immaturity. For as I wrote in a song of mine called What is Love, not a church binds God as its own, not a creed makes him fully known. Foolish we, if we limit him. Every atom is his throne. It was not your teacher's destiny to find what he was seeking in his own country. This does not mean that others have not found it. Each one must follow his own path, but the goal is infinity itself. Okay, so now we're working with, there has been somebody who's influencing this person, a teacher, and Swami sort of touches on that. He said sometimes it happens that someone will have a small experience compared to infinity, but a large experience compared to their ordinary consciousness, and having no appropriate satsang, which is to say, not having around them individuals whose wisdom is greater than their own, they can completely misread what's happened to them. And as Swami is saying here, apparently this woman is involved with someone who has a very narrow perception, seemingly, of Christ. And now Swami says, and apparently this teacher, perhaps this woman herself, has accused Yogananda in some way. If Yogananda was influenced by a deceptive spirit, then implying the test Jesus himself gave us, we would have to say that the results of that deception must have been demonstrated in Yogananda's life. Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. So this teacher has obviously challenged Yogananda's right to make the claims he does, because his own perception of the divine didn't match Master's. Swami's being very kind. He's not always kind. There's a whole section in this book called Strong Medicine. But in this case, he's being kind. The fruits of the divine life are selfless love, humility, and all divine qualities. These Yogananda manifested in his life to a greater degree than I have ever seen in anyone else. I do not want to enter a controversy on this point, but only to help you keep your mind open, for a narrow mind cannot accommodate the vast ocean of divine love. Yet I am happy for you that you have found a path that satisfies you and inspires you to deeper faith in divine friendship. So you see how Swami plays all of that? He tries to open this person's mind to a greater possibility than they're presently accepting. Perhaps your teacher did have a true experience, but perhaps didn't quite see the whole of it. If you're raising questions about Yogananda, well, let's go back to Jesus and see how they think. And here he also says, but he says in the end, I don't want to have a controversy with you. I mean, what's the point? Yogananda is, Yogananda isn't, this teacher is, this teacher isn't. I mean, it just becomes absolutely pointless. And at the very end, Swami says, and keep your mind open. A narrow mind cannot encompass the vastness of infinity. Yet, I am happy for you that you found something that gives you faith and gives you a way to relate to God. You see how just broad-minded he was? He wouldn't have even said as much as he did if he didn't feel there was some openness in her. But after he gives her, I keep saying her, and I don't know why I think that, he gives her all the reasons why she might expand her mind beyond what she's asserting. But then in the end, he says, if this is helping you, go ahead and just keep doing it. So in this way, you see, Swami, he signs it in divine friendship. In this way, he makes someone feel that I'm here to help you, but not to insist. I respect your right to choose what you're going to choose. These are some things to consider if you want to. Swamiji said, you should never expect that people will listen to you. In fact, you should feel quite honored if they do. And he didn't mean that sarcastically. It's like there's no reason why anybody should listen just because I say it or you say it or Swami Kriyananda says it. They should listen if it resonates with truth within them. But from the other side of it, there's no reason that anybody there's no reason why anybody should listen to what I say unless you want to listen to what I say. And when I offer it, it's not like I expect you to listen. It's just there it is. It's been meaningful to me. It feels like a duty to share it. And if when people write me and say, oh, this was helpful and that was helpful, I just say it's a privilege to serve. I'm just delighted that something was useful. It's not, nobody owes it to me. And nobody owes it because I have a position, because I'm a Nayaswami, because I've been leading a community. None of that makes any difference. It's a privilege to talk about these great teachings. And if it helps someone, I feel so grateful to God for that reason. We have to be careful because we fall into this, well, I know, and people should listen to me. Why should they? I mean, it's just actually, why should they? So now, a Roman Catholic expressed interest in moving to Ananda. This was also, as it happens, a woman. The other one, I don't know if it was. Let me just look for a minute. This was a woman also from the East Coast who was writing to Swami in California, and she'd become interested through some particular aspect of his work. And she was actually a practicing Catholic, and she was under the guidance of a priest. But she became very drawn to Ananda, and she was a very honest woman and an intellectual one. She was trying to figure out how to make it work because she was capable of living wherever she wanted to live. Whatever her work was, it was portable. So Swami says, I've been thinking and meditating on your question, which has come up before, which is if someone who's following another path can live within the community of Ananda. It seems to me it might be better for you to live outside Ananda and think of us as your friends rather than live within Ananda and struggle to reconcile your beliefs with masters. Isn't that an interesting way to put it? He didn't put it in terms of, well, these are our rules. Only disciples of master can live here. This is the way we found it works. It's too confusing if we have too many different paths, which in fact he says in another place. He says when he first started Ananda, there were too many people who were following different paths. And he said the kitchen was always the place of conflict. Krishna doesn't like onions. Well, Yogananda likes onions. It just becomes hard in your own home to be arguing about fundamentals. So Swami could have answered her, well, if you're not really on this path, then this may not be your place. But he says to her, instead he says, you will be struggling. You will constantly be struggling to reconcile your own beliefs with Master's teachings. So Swami's thought is always for the other. I mean, it's not that he would never say it's our rule and you can't do it, but he answered this person according to what she needed. I was hoping your visit to Ananda village would resolve your questions on reincarnation, but you seem to have the same problems with this as before. So you can see that was part of the issue. She was a Catholic. She didn't believe in reincarnation. He was hoping that somehow coming to Ananda could soften her, but it didn't. And now she has a problem with what Master said about the Eucharist compared to what the Catholics say about it. I'll be happy to discuss these issues of dogma with you when I see you, but I seriously suspect they won't be resolved quickly or easily. To me, the issues are clear, and I have no problem confronting both of them openly and sincerely. But habits of thinking are a powerful anchor, and I'm afraid other doubts would also arise in time. There's also another factor here that this person was older. The person was older and extremely thoughtfully committed to the dogmas that she was committed to. So Swami just didn't see how this was really going to work. I myself, Swami said, am unhesitating in expressing my views, and I really fear I might offend you with some of them. I wouldn't want to, but in my own home of Ananda, I won't be careful as I would be in public. At Ananda, I expect everyone to be on the same wavelength, and I don't weigh my words carefully. I don't even want to weigh them. I'm perfectly likely to speak of Master's incarnation as Arjuna or as William the Conqueror, or of my own as Henry I. Chatty stuff for us, but a bit of a conversation stopper for someone who can't accept reincarnation as even a possibility. Moreover, my sense of humor is all too likely to tip the scales for someone who feels he has a contrary belief to defend. Isn't that a marvelous explanation? And Swami's just telling the truth. You're going to come here and I'm going to say things that are really going to upset you. And, chatty stuff for us. And also Swami's sense of humor. I've seen this happen. That it's just like there's a world that Ananda lives in, a cultural world that Ananda lives in, which we're very, very comfortable with. And when people, as he said it, have beliefs they need to defend, it's very tense. It's very tense to be around us. And so this is a good woman with very positive things. And you see, Swamiji's teaching goes out in so many directions. She can be interested in one aspect of it without wanting to take in the whole of it. So this is what had captured her. So Swami says, for your own peace of mind, I'd say you were safer where you are. Much though I reacted positively to your wish to join us. The door is open. I am only pointing out the difficulties in your mind, not in our acceptance of you. See again how nuanced that is? He's saying to her, this is what it's going to be like for you here. You really have to think about it. And also, this was something I remember. There was this family. They lived in Sacramento. And they had an aspiration to join Ananda, to move from Sacramento. And it was a couple with children, a couple of children, one or two, I don't remember. And Swamiji, and sort of like all of us, were just kind of like encouraging and trying to make it happen. And then Swamiji said, don't encourage them. He said, especially about the man, but about both of them, he said, they wouldn't make it living in Ananda. They just wouldn't be able to sustain themselves on many different levels. He said, it's better for them to have the aspiration to move here than to try to live in the community and fail. Isn't that interesting? So it's just like, it's not for everyone. And Swami was very attuned to that. It's just, this is a lifestyle and a way of life. And they can be loyal to the teachings. They can be peripherally involved, but They wouldn't be able to sustain the energy level if they had to try to live inside the ashram. Better to let them aspire to live there. I've always remembered that. Because see, sometimes when things are not working out for people, if you have a lot of willpower, you rush in and try to make them work. It happened even within the course of life at Ananda village, community life. There were different regimes, so to speak, different periods of time where existing members would try too hard to make it work for the people who are trying to move there. And too hard because they would just keep smoothing over things that really needed to be confronted. Just like when Swami was talking to that Catholic woman, I mean, her situation was different, but there were real issues that could not just be wished away. And sometimes people would come and they didn't have the commitment, they didn't necessarily have the energy level, they didn't have the karmic freedom, and people just kept trying to think they were helping by making it work. Sometimes you just have to stand back and see where people really belong, instead of just assuming that making it work for them in this way will help them. Swami was very kind, he was very supportive, but he was also very impersonal. Not everybody, goes back to one of the earlier letters. We're all equally loved by God. God is the solution for everyone. It's just a question of how we approach him. So that which is a wonderful lifestyle for one person really may not suit someone else. And it takes more intuition than dogma to really help people. So this next letter, this is advice to a woman with an abusive relative. This is in November of 1980. Your question is a complex one, and it is harder not being able to actually talk to you about it. I do not feel I can deal with the psychological problems of your brother, especially as they are so deep-seated and the situation has gone on for so long. What I can do, and what I feel is important, is to give you spiritual advice, which I hope will help you stay calm and centered. There is little you or anyone can do for your brother until he seeks help and puts out the effort to help himself. What you can and must do is to help yourself. Be strong, like the saints who are not affected by being tortured or put into concentration camps, except by becoming more joyful. Ensure that you and your daughter are physically safe from your brother. Once you have ensured that you are physically safe, why is there any need for fear and anxiety? It is only making you unhappy, and it is demonstrating to your brother that his actions have an effect upon you. If he cannot get the attention he craves in the form of affection, then your fear is almost as satisfying to him. Swami just doesn't pull punches, does he? But see, this is also, it's very important to hear him talk like this, because Swamiji loved everyone. He would have done anything anything he could do to help this man, but he never sugarcoated. He just puts it out there just like that. If your brother can't get his affection, he's going to try to get you to be afraid of him. That is not a complimentary thing to say. Swami also says it. He says it without judgment, though. It's just like, this is what it is. This man is 6'2" tall, and this is his psychology, and this is what he's doing. Okay, so this is what we're working with. And it doesn't help us to sugarcoat it. It doesn't help us to overstate it, but it certainly doesn't help us to understate it either. Do not give him this privilege of making you afraid. Practice the yoga techniques and feel God's reassurance and calmness during meditation. See this as a lesson for you to develop courage and even-mindedness. In your meditation, pray for your brother and forgive him. Then you are free. I don't know how much of this you have done already, but I would suggest that, out of love, not hate, you be very firm with your brother. Ignore him completely. Have no communication with him. Demonstrate that he has no effect on you. Enlist the aid of the police if necessary to discourage him from staying near your house, but do not get involved yourself. If at the same time others in his life would offer him love and attention and help, This may divert his attention from you. I hope this is of some help. I am praying for you and God bless you. So there it is, Swami doesn't say, oh, you must love him, you must constantly keep trying, you can't give up. He says, cut him out of your life because he's very unwholesome. And this is how you get free. But don't hate him, don't hold a grudge against him. And then Swami also says, this is your karma. You have to develop the courage to do this. Because you can sort of read between the lines here. She keeps giving him another chance. He tries to insist. Swami says, draw the line and hold to it. He says it, Swami says in here, pray for him. I was going to put out, sometimes I give people slightly different advice. I say, give him to Divine Mother and then don't think about him anymore. Because sometimes I have found if there is great vulnerability to someone's power over you, you don't want to even put your mind on him. Because even when you try to pray for him, you may inadvertently open a channel to him, and also you'll be preoccupied with him. I've not that I've actually ever done this, but I've recommended it. Sometimes you write a prayer. I have my altar where I have pictures on my altar, and I have at different times taken the picture frames and taken the backs off and put prayers in there and then put the backs back on, so that I know that they're always on my altar. They're always being prayed for. And this is especially effective if it's someone you don't want to be thinking about. You can put it behind the picture if you want, or maybe that's even too much. You just say one time very firmly, Divine Mother, I give him to you. I'm not going to, that I would like to help him, but it doesn't help me to think about him. But what Swami is saying, what will make you free is when you become even-minded about this. Fear, anger, revenge, guilt, you have to just be even-minded. This man is not healthy. And in this case, I have a daughter to protect. He's not healthy. He's dangerous. I'm going to cut my ties with him. And it takes a lot of courage to do that, a lot of energy and commitment. That's what Swami's telling us here. I often say, being nice is not necessarily a spiritual quality. Being appropriate is what we need to be. The word we want here is you have to have an appropriate relationship with people. In this case, this man sounds like he's really horrible to her. And even if he himself is miserable and he makes her feel sorry for him, it doesn't sound to me like he has anything but selfish motive. And you have to respond appropriately when someone is behaving that way. And if that appropriateness is very stern, that's what you have to do. Oh, this question is abortion ever appropriate? The taking of life is a broader issue than just the legal one. Human law may recognize a higher law, but it cannot alter it. The only mitigating factor I can think of in taking an embryo's life is if the mother's life is seriously threatened. And that's just Swami's position on that. I know that's not a popular position, but that was his position. I'll say more about this in a moment. In the case you've described, I think abortion was indeed possible within the divine law. But even so, it would be a difficult matter to decide. Just within the situation you described, some kind of, Swami says the mother's life is at stake, or the conditions where the pregnancy might have been because of rape or incest or something like that. And then Swami says, this is, I realize, a very sensitive social issue nowadays. I am hesitant to plunge into it with seeming callousness, particularly where I myself am not at all affected. Isn't that just like, this is a difficult issue. I hesitate to plunge in because I will, with callousness, where I'm not affected. It's easy for me to say, you should do this, you should do that, you should have the child, you should raise it. And you can just appear, even if, see, this is what happens in this particular discussion. People who are not, who feel strongly against abortion often appear extremely callous in the assertion of that point of view because they're not really affected by the pregnancy that you're having. And they just act as if they can just tell you what to do. And it does feel, don't you understand what I'm up against, what my circumstances are? So Swami says, I hesitate to plunge in because I'm not involved, I'm not affected. Nevertheless, conscience bids me speak truthfully when I am asked. The soul is already present in the forming fetus and is there, Master said, from the moment of conception. Taking the life of a growing creature cannot, except in extreme circumstances to which I would be inclined to include rape, be condoned either morally or spiritually. That's the question that Master says, that the soul, the individual spark of spirit, enters in at the moment of conception. The sperm and the ovum come together, and what makes that more than just, whatever you would say, just biological waste matter, is that when the two meet, there's a divine spark and a soul enters, and life begins at conception. That is not what a lot of people believe or want to believe, because if life begins at conception, there's no point in pregnancy when you're not terminating a life. And there's a great deal of effort made to say that somehow or another life begins later, but Master said differently. And Swami just says, it's just is what it is. That's what Master says. So, conscience bids me to speak truthfully when I am asked. That's how Swami put it. He rarely spoke about this, and he rarely volunteered. But if somebody asks you directly, when does life begin? Is early abortion actually taking the life of the child or not? Conscience bids me to speak the truth. Now Swamiji says, for those who have already had abortions, it is important not to feel a weight of guilt. There was surely not a will to kill involved, and that certainly is the main thing. We make many mistakes in life. Our duty is to love all the more deeply. The sins, which are only errors of judgment of countless incarnations, will be washed away forever by God's grace when we find Him. Now, I myself, over the many decades, this is a question that has often come up. I have a personal policy. When somebody comes to me and wants to ask me in a personal, practical way about an abortion, I'll never discuss it with them. That's just how I deal with it. I'm sorry, that's not a question that I'll answer. I mean, especially when a woman comes into me pregnant and there's 3 of us in the room, I just can't do it. So it doesn't come up that often, but when it has, I've just simply said, I can't talk about that subject. I can't be involved in it. Because I do believe what Master said about conception being there. I've never been pregnant in this lifetime. I mean, I've never been pregnant at all, so I have no idea what an unwelcome pregnancy feels like. And I know in our society, abortion is so accessible to people and is considered to be so acceptable. It's just virtually an acceptable form of birth control. So many, many people that I know who are very deeply involved now in the spiritual path have had abortions. And people I know after they've come onto the spiritual path have had abortions. It's one of those things that is part of our life right now. So Swami's distinction here is extremely important. There's no point in feeling guilt. There was no will to kill. It wasn't like I was going out on purpose to do this evil thing. I know that I remember one woman in particular who carried a tremendous amount of guilt from an abortion she'd had early in her life, years before she came to Ananda. And she just was guilty about it almost all the time. She finally went to Swami. It was very interesting how he responded. He went like this, oh, that soul has been incarnated and is living fine that soul reincarnated in another body a long time ago. That's how Swami put it. Just like, yes, that soul tried to come through your body as its mother, and that didn't work, so it just went somewhere else. So part of it is you have to realize also, this is a living person. The developing fetus, and this is, of course, the difficulty. This is a full person just like you or me. This is not a fetus. This is a soul who has lived in many lifetimes and will live many more lifetimes and wants to have a human body to have another life. It's bringing in the full reality of its consciousness and its experience. It's not a child, it's an old person who recently died, and it has its own karma. So it knows, the soul being in an expanded state of awareness, it knows when it enters into that sperm and ovum, it knows what it's coming into. And it may well already know that it's not going to actually have a life. Master said, certain kinds of karmic misdeeds in the past cause you to, when you don't value life, he raised, among others, suicide. That if you haven't respected the opportunity to have a physical body or have mistreated it badly in some way, just haven't respected the gift of human life, then you have trouble getting it back. I mean, that would be natural. So you would sort of be ready to incarnate, and then the incarnation wouldn't happen. And some people speculate, and I really can't say, that the soul that comes to you to be a fetus that is not going to live full term to be a baby, it's a karmic agreement between you. Sometimes that experience is a profound experience for the woman doing it, or the man and woman doing it. And it's a necessary lesson they have to learn. And it's certainly the fate of the person who's trying to be born but isn't going to be. In other words, these are very complicated questions. And the more nuanced we are, and the less callous we are when we ourselves are not personally affected, the better off we'll be. I was very moved by a book I read, and I wish I could give you the name of it. It's a current popular book. It was written by an evangelical clergy person who was extremely active in the anti-abortion movement. And he also became very politically influential. This is being recorded in July 2020. Very politically influential, and was a big sort of voice for the religious right, as they say, in Washington, D.C. And then a couple of abortion doctors who gave abortion, were either attacked or killed. And this preacher began to realize that, that family had been deprived of a father, or that man was deprived of his profession, because there was another case in which the injuries were so severe that he couldn't practice any form of medicine after that. And he said, because of what I did, because he stirred up so much anger, and that even though he hadn't pulled the trigger, he'd been responsible. And he started feeling that there was a great contrast between what he was doing and what Jesus would have done. And gradually, if you look it up, if you're really interested in the book, which was a very interesting book, it was the fundamentalist pastor who became disenchanted with the mixture of religion and politics. He just began to realize that he felt that this whole thing of getting into politics, especially in the way that has been done recently, to push a political agenda on spiritual grounds, he felt it was a terrible mistake. But his whole business about abortion, which is he was one of those really responsible for creating the really aggressive anti-abortion stand. I find it a very complex issue because of what I was saying. I don't feel comfortable with the concept, but I've never been tested. So the fact that I've never been tested makes me not qualified to really know, what a complicated thing it could be to have a child come into your life at a time when it's just not congenial to have that happen. But my heart goes out to everyone in the issue. We live in very difficult times. It's just the only thing I can say. We live in very difficult times. This is to a person discouraged by certain Ananda village. Actually, I'm going to just move to one that's a little shorter. This is called a God-given responsibility, and this was written in the late 80s. I have done my best to make this person see sense. I did agree with her about her wish to try homeopathy, but I said that if it doesn't bring about a change quickly, she must go through with the advice of Peter and her other doctors. Now, what's going on here is that someone has a very serious medical condition. They do not want to follow allopathic methods. Dr. Peter is an allopathic doctor who's run a clinic at Ananda Village for the last 35 years. And Dr. Peter at Ananda Village is the medical professional who gives us advice. But this person has a very serious condition, but they want to try natural means. They have a prejudice against allopathic methods. So, Swami has a position. I have done my best to make this person see sense. I did agree with her about her wish to try homeopathy, but I said if that doesn't bring about a change quickly, she must go through with the advice of Peter and the other doctors. Swami's just taking a pretty strong position. You might remind her of what I said and urge her, now that 2 months have passed, which is a reasonable test period in a case as critical as hers, to get herself tested again. In other words, to find out whether or not whatever the condition is has been fixed. Don't just say, I want it to be fixed and therefore it is. Her body is a responsibility given her by God. If she fails to take reasonable care of it, she will be held accountable in her next life. Now that is really something, isn't it? Your body is a God-given responsibility. If you behave irresponsibly toward it, that will be karma that you'll have in your next life. What kind of karma would that be? Sudden early death? It could be. When you had the opportunity by the medicine was there in front of you, you could have healed yourself, but out of a prejudice or a stubborn determination to do it your own way, instead you lost your life, and the whole incarnation, the potential of the whole incarnation was thrown away. Conceivably in the next incarnation, and I'm just guessing, you'll die young. When you want to have your life will be taken away from you. Maybe you'll suffer ill health. Maybe you'll be pushed again to the same point and we'll have to make different choices, but you'll be held accountable for it. And this is, I said sometimes Swami speaks strongly. It's pretty strong. Doctors have admittedly much to learn about the body, but they know much also, and in serious cases like this should not be ignored. So Swamiji was very broad-minded about medical possibilities. It wasn't like he was prejudiced really in favor of one thing or another. I mean, he was always trying different far-out cures. There was a long cycle of all this water, energized water, which I believe is still a very popular thing. And Swamiji, really, for quite some time, he followed it very assiduously. He's worked with color therapy. He's worked with flower essences. He's very, very interested. But there are also cases that are just too serious and too urgent. And allopathic medicine is also given by God. It's just different. The doctors don't know everything, but as he said, they do know something. There was this woman at Ananda who was given a terminal cancer diagnosis. In fact, she did die of cancer, although she lived quite a few years longer than the doctors expected. But she wanted to cure herself by natural means, didn't want to go the allopathic route. With cancer, it can be pretty intense. And she said that, and Swami just looked at her very seriously. He knew her very well. He looked her very straight in the eye, and when she said, I would like to cure myself by natural means, non-allopathic medicine, Swami said, do you have the concentration, the discipline, and the willpower to actually do that? And she sort of looked at him for a moment and said, no, sir, I don't. And that was the actual answer. It wasn't that it couldn't be done. It was that it was presumptuous and wishful thinking on her part to think that she actually could do it. Now, I know many people who have cured themselves of cancer in quite unconventional manners. So I'm not talking about whether it can be done. It's a question of when it ought to be tried and what is motivating you to try it. So she actually went a very strong allopathic route. She had a young child, and she lived 7 more years, which was extremely important in the life of her child. She did it by draconian allopathic methods, but it's quite likely she would not have survived even a year if she hadn't done that. I'm not going to say. It's hard to say. But Swami's expressing a point of view here also. Go ahead, let her try, but only for so long. And then you have to really face into this. It's interesting. Master told Swami and others and several times Master spoke of he put a certain idea into someone's mind, that he was the inspiring force behind other people's inventions. In modern times, Steve Jobs, who really innovated a tremendous amount of of our technology these days, he had a very close inward tie with Yogananda, with Autobiography of a Yogi, and he talked about it often. At his funeral, he instructed that everyone should be given a free copy of Autobiography of a Yogi. So it seems self-evident that Master was inspiring and guiding a great deal of what he did, because he virtually has defined our lives at this point, personally. I mean, so what does that have to do with spirituality? Well, for one thing, we're talking to each other now through all these mediums, because the masters are involved in society in many ways. So the end point of this is, Master said, and I'll quote just because that's what he said, that he put the idea into the medical researcher's mind, the principle of antihistamines. Now, I'm not a medical person, I don't know anything about this, but when Dr. Peter heard Swami say that, he said, "Sir, that's extremely interesting, because it was a breakthrough. It was an important research breakthrough," Peter said, "that opened the way to a lot of other medical breakthroughs, that it was a key understanding, however that translates in actual terms." And so, advances in technology are also part of God's plan. And a lot of times, before we had these medicines, people died. They died younger, or they were debilitated longer. So we can't just be prejudiced. We have to be really open, especially because keeping the body is a God-given responsibility. So nothing is simple. Everything is nuanced. Well, my friends, God bless you.